We're going to add to our repertoire now with a really versatile data structure called a graph. In this sequence, I'll start with an overview of graphs and the relationship to other things that we've seen. And that pun is totally intended because graphs are all about relationships. So I'm going to start with just an overview in this episode and use the bulk of the sequence after this to animate the main kinds of search algorithms that we use with graphs. Okay, so we've seen graphs before, though we didn't call them that. Linked lists and binary trees are both specific types of graphs where the particular rules gives us these shapes. A linked list is made up of boxes and arrows where each box can reference at most one other box with an arrow. And a binary tree is also made up of boxes and arrows where each box can reference at most two other boxes using arrows. A graph is also made up of boxes and arrows, and in the most generic case, there aren't rules about how many connections each box can have, or even if the connections have arrowheads on them. Graphs model the relationship between things. Maybe they're computers on a network or data centers in North America. Maybe a graph models people in their social network or criminals in their organization. Or maybe you've brainstormed ideas and created a mind map of ideas and drawn lines that connect some of them. The food web is another example you've probably heard of. So take this social network, for example. Who are my friends in Colorado? You can run a search algorithm starting with a node representing you. Who are all my friends of friends? That's another search where you only go 2 layers deep, starting with the me node. Who are all my friends of friends who live in Colorado? This is a combination of those two algorithms. And we're going to cover these algorithms in the next couple of episodes. Okay, so graphs are central to a lot of different disciplines, from math to marketing and all over the place in software. And given that it isn't surprising that all the different disciplines have their own jargon for it. And so I'm sort of blithely using the term box and arrow, which isn't exactly formal, but it does communicate the idea. You have items and you have relationships between those items. A node is an item in a graph, such as it's often drawn as a box or a circle or any other way that says this is a thing. They're often called vertices, and a single one is called a vertex. And if you're modeling something where those things have a better name, like if you're modeling a social network, then you could also use that name, like person. An edge connects nodes together. They can be called links and connections and anything else that connotes a relationship between the things in the graph. So in a social network, an edge might be called a friend relationship. There are lots of kinds of graphs because there are lots of domains to model and different ways to model them. So this includes things like where the first node is, what the nature of the edges are, what rules there are around how nodes can be connected, and what kinds of paths you might form by navigating a graph. Graph nodes can have any number of related nodes. So while lists and binary trees were limited to 1 or 2 children, graph nodes could potentially be related to thousands of other nodes. Though the term child node probably isn't apt, since graphs often model relationships that aren't about hierarchy. With linked lists and binary trees, there was an obvious first node, like the start of a list or root of a tree. But with graphs, unless there's some domain-specific reason to believe otherwise, there isn't a clear first node. For example, a social network might not have a single primary node unless you're talking about your own personal network, and then you can be at the center of that. So earlier when I've said box and arrow diagram, that's actually wrong in an important way. Many graphs have edges that go both ways. If you're friends with someone, it's a mutual arrangement. So in that case, you draw it as boxes and lines, not with arrows. And we call this an undirected edge. But if two things do have some kind of ordering, you can draw the relation using a line and an arrowhead, which we call a directed edge. It can be helpful to attach information to both nodes and edges. Like an edge in a social network might be for a specific relationship, like Bob works with Alice, or Bob works for Alice, or Bob and Alice dated in college, and so on. So they're working with each other, and yeah. So edges can have numeric weights. telling you the distance between cities or whatever else you might want to model. And when we run algorithms on graphs, it can be helpful to track metadata on how the algorithm's going, like when did the algorithm first discover a node, or what path did we take from nodes A and B. So they say that no man is an island, but we can model that anyway using a graph. Nodes in a graph don't have to be connected to anything. Or you could have a few nodes that are connected to each other, but not to other groups. Now, it looks funny, but it's also possible and sometimes necessary for a node to have an edge that connects back to itself. You'll see this more if you watch the finite state machine sequence. If you want to dive more into the math around graphs, there's a zillion ways you can slice and dice them, usually with more jargon to go along with it. I'm just mentioning this here so that you're aware of that I'm not trying to convey everything there is to know about graphs. Just suffice it to say, if there's something that you need to model with a graph, there's probably a formal mathematical jargon to go with it, and probably also an algorithm with someone else's name on it. One kind of graph that I do want to call out because they appear so often is the directed acyclic graph, which all the cool people call by its initials DAG. DAGs. This kind of graph has directed edges, like the name implies. It also means that it can't have cycles. A cycle is where you start at one node and then follow the directed edges through the graph and get back to where you started. There are a lot of algorithms that take advantage of DAGs. If you're trying to get an undergraduate degree, you've probably encountered these even if you didn't realize it. When you start the degree program, there are some classes that you have to take in a certain order and others that you can take in any order. And all these boxes that represent classes all point to the same terminal node, which is when you graduate. In lots of video games, for example, you can unlock capabilities that only by doing something else first. So another example is from video game tech trees. In project management, they often model project work looking like this as well. And whatever the longest path is called the critical path because it determines when the project as a whole will be finished. So this episode was just introducing the topic of graphs as a versatile data structure for modeling the relationships between things. In the next few episodes, I'm going to cover two main algorithms for traversing graphs called breadth-first search and depth-first search.